As we see, regret is a powerful force. It's no surprise that it drives the actions of characters in many films. It became a key theme in Richard Linklater's magnificent trilogy, Before Sunrise, 1995, Before Sunset, 2004, and Before Midnight, 2013. In the first film, Jesse Ethan Hawke meets Celine Julie Delpy on a train from Budapest. Jesse persuades Celine to get off in Vienna and spend the night walking around the city with him. His arguments are a classic example of picturing future regret. If Celine does not go with him, he says, in 10 or 20 years she will remember this moment and think how differently her life could have turned out. The film ends with plans to meet at the train station in 6 months. In the second film, set 9 years later, it turns out the promised meeting never happened. But Jesse wrote a bestseller based on the train meeting, and now the paths of the heroes cross again, this time in Paris, where Jesse arrives on a promotional tour. They spend the rest of the day walking around the city, sharing their regrets and reflecting on how differently their lives would have turned out if the meeting hadn't fallen through. In the last film, set another 9 years forward, Jesse and Celine are married. However, they find themselves again at a crossroads, now because of doubts about their love for each other. Jesse once again plays the same trick of moving into the future to look back at the present and conclude that they will consider this night one of the best in their lives. The main hero of the film, Casablanca, Rick Humphrey Bogart, the owner of a somewhat shady nightclub, longs for Ilse Ingrid Bergman, in whom he fell in love a year earlier in Paris. Ilse then suddenly disappeared without explanation, after which Rick became the cynical and grim businessman we see at the start of the film. Later it turns out that Ilse was married, but believed her husband Victor Laszlo had died in a concentration camp, and upon suddenly learning that Laszlo had escaped, she hurried to him from Paris without saying a word to Rick. When a year later Ilse and Laszlo enter Rick's club, the hero must decide whether to help them get to America. Ilse and Rick are still in love, and Laszlo understands this. Casablanca remains one of the most popular films in cinema history. Even if the dialogues now seem unnatural, the central theme of doomed love still resonates with us. Although Rick does the right thing by letting Ilse go with Laszlo, the main feeling we experience after their separation is, what if? What if Laszlo really had died in the camp? Would Rick and Ilse have stayed together? These films serve as masterclasses on leveraging anticipated future regret to make decisions in the present. They vividly show us how productively regret can be used to shape future narratives. Instead of fixating on the past and mourning what didn't happen, one can move into the future and, guided by simulated regret, make decisions in the present moment. The mantra to avoid regret proves very effective, perhaps even the best life strategy. It works for a computer playing poker and for characters in romantic films. It will work for you too. But don't forget, relying on essentially fictional narratives of the future, there will be worse and better variants among them. In the next chapter, we will try to distinguish good narratives from bad ones and embark on a journey where we will learn to write narratives oriented toward the future. Everyone wants their life to be filled with meaning, but meaning is a direct result of the narrative a person builds for themselves. This is an active process requiring constant monitoring of the interpretation of events as they happen and placing them in the context of who you are and who you want to be. Chapter 17. A Worthy Life. Throughout the book, we have exposed illusions and visited different versions of our I. We have learned that our personal narrative is far from accurate and is formed by memories compressed according to canonical experiences called basis functions, which, in turn, impart certain colors to everything we experience. At the same time, our Bayesian brain creates the most probable interpretation of any event, filling gaps in perception with fiction. Moreover, our perception is seasoned with judgments from other people, and ideas that seem to us as our own are most likely borrowed from somewhere. And now, remembering all of the above, we return to the question posed at the very beginning of the book. Which of our I is real? The way we perceive ourselves, the way others imagine us, the way we present ourselves to others. As you might have guessed, the answer is all of it together. I like to compare the task of constructing a narrative to the work of a director. We have footage, a selection of life frames, and we constantly edit them to produce a coherent story. The director's task is to deliver a finished film to the producer and distributors. However, if we consider the whole life as a finished film, the analogy breaks down, since you probably would not want to present the audience with a final version only after your death. However, narratives operate on other time scales, so it is more useful to imagine a personal narrative as a series of films. Recall your favorite series with sequels. Which of them withstand the test of time? The Godfather trilogy comes to mind, but it is a story spanning several generations, with a sprawling cast of characters, so it's not well suited as a model for a personal narrative. Perhaps then the original Star Wars trilogy, episodes IV, V, and VI. Although it has an epic scale even surpassing The Godfather, at its core it is still the story of one person, Luke Skywalker. We have already analyzed how Star Wars corresponds to Campbell's monomyth formula. Other trilogies focusing mainly on the fate of one hero include Terminator, Rocky, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, The Matrix, Mad Max, Alien, Indiana Jones, and The Lord of the Rings. But my narrative is already half created, you might object. You can't just change the story and start all over again. Actually, you can. We are accustomed to stories having a beginning, middle, and end. This classic three-part structure was described by the 19th century German novelist Gustav Freytag. Having analyzed ancient Greek and Shakespearean plays, Freytag determined that they all follow a predictable scheme of rising and falling action, now known as Freytag's pyramid. This scheme still dominates film scripts. I do not call it a formula only because it is a description, not a prescription. Yet our personal narrative does not necessarily have to precisely repeat the biological one. Although human life always has a natural beginning and end, by itself these do not represent interest from a narrative perspective. Who is interested in hearing that so-and-so was born, went through various good and bad things, and eventually died? No, we are interested in twists and turns. What troubles did they get into? What did they risk losing? Did they manage to pull through, or did they suffer defeat? And most importantly, why was it all? These are exactly the motives traced in good stories, because these are the motives to which we give preference in our own narratives. But they too must have a starting point. Unlike the story of the uninteresting so-and-so, most good stories do not begin with the hero's birth, unless his name is David Copperfield. They begin in medias res in the middle of events. Homer, Odyssey, begins after the Trojan War, and we learn about the hero's life while listening to the epic about his journey home. In our own narratives, we often find it difficult to step outside the sequential development of events. Our narrative naturally builds as a continuous chain from the past, from our earliest memories. But suppose you manage to break beyond its limits. Then you can tell a new story, one that begins today. However, to start a new story, we still need a scheme or template. We cannot begin a story without understanding where it leads, because otherwise it would read like a series of diary entries, a chronicle of events covered as they occur without understanding their meaning and significance. Most of us, by default, lean toward the format of the hero's journey. Well, a quite worthy format, but I think one can find a better idea from the philosophers of antiquity. Although the hero's journey and the virtuous life give us extensive templates for narrative, they do not teach us how to create a life narrative. I propose we learn this from Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who spent several years in Nazi concentration camps. He comes closest to what we all seek in our narratives, the meaning of life. How do we do this? We tell stories, to ourselves and others. Yes, it really is that simple. Meaning arises from the narratives we create. Viktor Frankl sees three paths to finding meaning. The first path is to create something or perform some meaningful deed. From the perspective of narrative forms, this corresponds to the hero's journey. The second path is to experience some feelings or meet someone. Frankl associates this path with love, which, in his view, is the only way to see another person through and through. The third path is suffering. Finding meaning in suffering itself is difficult, so Frankl suggests that one in trouble project themselves into the future. And then, anticipating the theory of regret, Frankl asks this future, I, to look back and imagine what lessons it will have drawn from the experience. This strategy works better in the realm of fiction, since it is too easy to get stuck in the tedious details of real life. Fiction frees us from the chains of chronology. And remember, we are only practicing. Let your imagination run free. Here is a mental experiment about dissociation. Imagine you have the ability to clone yourself, so that the clone exactly copies not only your body, but also your brain with all your memories. and you immediately reach the first fork in the narrative. You can live your previous life and write the story of the clone's new life, or your place is taken by the clone, and you will write the story of your own new life. Of course, metaversions immediately arise, namely, what will happen to the person who continues to live their life knowing that somewhere else their alternative version lives, and vice versa? But we will not consider these yet, so choose from the two main ideas. Either you start a new life or the clone does. The next task is to outline the time frame for your story. Here we slightly depart from the cinematic formula. In most films, the action fits into a period of several days to several weeks. There are exceptions, including relatively rare examples where screen time equals real time, as in Dog Day Afternoon. It happens that the action stretches over years or decades. Forrest Gump, The Godfather, 2001, A Space Odyssey. We are aiming for an unoccupied cinematic territory of time spans from 1 to 10 years. Meaningful changes require at least a year, but usually much more. Probably 1 year is too short and 10 years too far ahead. So, let's take about 5 years, that is optimal. Try to imagine what your clone will do. They can become whoever you want. Who will they be in 5 years? This is the story's finale you are tuning into, but I suppose it's impossible to immediately imagine this final shot. Let's recall storytelling tools and ask ourselves what concerns this clone of yours. They have been given all your memories and values, so you only need to dig into yourself. If you were this clone, what would you want? I think it's best to start with characteristics related to quality of life. What does your clone value 5 years from now? Write down several statements in the present tense. This is important. Try to come up with at least 5 points covering areas such as relationships, financial expectations, physical and mental health, sources of joy, and what you or your clone want to dedicate your time to. If you are envisioning the hero's journey, the statements should revolve around feats and achievements. If you lean toward the ethics of virtue, they should reflect its ideals. Here are some example statements. Yours should express your own values, which your clone fully shares. I have a close circle of family and colleagues whom I rely on and whom I can turn to for advice and help if needed. My spouse and I spend enough time together. I don't waste money, but I have enough resources for a comfortable life. I have no debts. I take at least 1 vacation per year. I have enough health and strength for hiking and bike rides. These will be the end goals for your 5-year narrative. Then make another list enumerating what you plan to do to make these statements come true. For example, to make the statement, I have no debts, reflect reality, you need to either increase income or reduce expenses. Therefore, in the action list, you might write, cut unnecessary expenses, pay off loans, fixed amount monthly, work overtime each pay period. If a goal is not a priority for you, don't include it in the list of statements characterizing your life. Let's take another example. We spend enough time together. The actions needed might be, spend 1 evening a week alone without any TV, and once a week cook breakfast or dinner together. The exercise may seem banal, but in reality, it will make you reflect on many things, since it captures the essence of the question, how should I reorient my life to make gaining meaning a priority? We often do not leave ourselves time to carefully consider what is important, so formulating values can be difficult. If the reflection directly involves someone else, a life partner, child, parents, it's good to do this exercise together. But be sure to write down the formulated statements in your own words. This record, by hand or on a computer, will concretize the results of your reflections and capture your current thoughts to return to in the future. It is possible that creating a satisfying list of goals will not succeed at first, but once it does, you will have a description of what matters to you and your clone, as well as a roadmap indicating how to reach what you have set out. Congratulations, now you have the skeleton of a new narrative, which is already moving forward. Perhaps looking at the resulting list, you may feel that fulfilling it is completely impossible. Maybe you currently have problems in relationships, and it's hard to get out of these difficulties. Then entrust the task to the clone, let them take your place and free you. In any case, you are faced with a striking moral dilemma, whether or not to continue living as you have until now. Since no one will know that the clone is not you, your choice will not affect others, children, for example. Now you could start writing the story, although for the exercise this is no longer necessary. One more thing is mandatory. that your characterizing statements and the accompanying goals serve as an alternative paradigm for interpreting what will happen to you on the further path. Do not forget that narratives in our heads are determined by two processes: compression and prediction of the future. Compression provides the ability to store and reproduce memories by basis functions. Based on the same basis functions, in the course of prediction, we interpret new events and store them as deviations from the narratives already stored in our heads. To create new narratives, you can prompt the system to interpret events differently, using precisely those lists of statements characterizing your life and planned goals. If it turns out poorly, ask yourself, how would my clone see this world? In essence, you create an alter ego through dissociation. You generate Mr. Hyde for your Dr. Jekyll, or vice versa. Some may not like the idea of deliberately inducing a split personality, but that's not our goal. I see the creation of an imaginary, ambitious alternative personality as a useful tool for refocusing perception. If a good book allows us to step into the shoes of the main character, what prevents any of us from imagining ourselves as the person we would like to become? Just don't think it will all go smoothly. There will be many obstacles, both external and internal. The internal ones are connected to the need to imagine alternative storylines. The invented clone is a narrative device designed to spark your imagination. Questions beginning with, what if, serve the same purpose. What if I quit this job? Or, what if I went back to university? Note that I do not include the obvious counterfactual, what if I won the lottery? Besides the fact that winning is practically improbable, it also does not depend on us at all. Statements in the spirit of what if work best when you retain agency, subjectivity. Only you can decide whether to stay at your current job or pursue something else. Only you can decide whether to continue a relationship with someone or end it. Only you can decide whether to move to another city. Naturally, every decision has its costs, but from the previous chapter, we have a lesson: to glance into the hypothetical future to check whether regret over what was done or not done awaits us there. External obstacles to the alternative narrative are connected to the fact that it will affect the people around you. The what-if exercise implies, among other things, the need to imagine the ripples spreading out from your action. Ideally, you will involve significant people in your life in this game, and then the scenario, what if I quit the job, might become, what if we quit the job? Don't be surprised if you don't find understanding. The exercise itself is not easy to perform, let alone to involve someone else in it 10 times more. No worthwhile endeavor is easy, so I want to end this chapter with words of encouragement. Change is possible. The hypothetical alternatives indicated in the previous paragraph are difficult because we are held back by fear of losing what we have and fear of the unknown. But it will not prevent us from changing our narrative. Life is a series of events. Narrative is what they mean to you. This is the main thing you need to remember. Perhaps the series of events itself is beyond your control, but how to present them is entirely in your power. Chapter 18. The Future I. At the very beginning of our journey, I asserted that each of us has 3 versions of self: the past, I, the current, and the future. At every moment, the current I flows into the past, yielding place to the future I. For the person themselves, this is somewhat like riding a train. The current I sits in the carriage and rushes along the rails of time. It seems to you that you yourself are not moving anywhere. Everything else is moving. The same happens with the current I, which exists here and now. But as Einstein explained, it all depends on the frame of reference. From the perspective of the driver of a car stopped at a railroad crossing, it is you who rush past. So it is you who change, not the surrounding world. From the first to the last chapter of the book, I have argued that the I of the past, present, and future, in reality, are different people. At the physical level, the molecular components of our body change every minute from day to day. Today you literally are not who you were yesterday. And only through the narratives we tell ourselves do we maintain the useful illusion that we remain the same person. From this concept, if you agree with it, it naturally follows that narratives are just another kind of computation performed by our brain. Most of the time, these computations are done automatically. Under normal circumstances, we do not freeze in anxious contemplation about whether we are still the same as we were before or not. Throughout this book, we examine the cognitive processes that contribute to the automatism of these computations. The brain is not a digital recording device, so memories must be stored in compressed form. Our first experiences and first stories lay down templates, and subsequent experiences are then compared with them and stored as deviations from these templates. Accordingly, our expectations of the future, driven by the same mechanisms, are tuned to deviations from the present. Your future, I, is not a separate finished entity. Wholeness for it is impossible since the future is yet unknown to us. The future, I, is a cloud of probabilities, each representing a hypothetical trajectory leading forward from the starting point in the present. Moreover, when we determine which stories to accept and assimilate, compression, forecasting, and dissociation come into play. Since we already have accumulated over the whole preceding life a baggage of narrative basis functions, substitution will inevitably proceed slowly and with difficulty. Replacing old narratives with fresher ones and reducing the frequency of accessing the old can be done, but it will require effort and time. This is what I want to devote the final chapter of my book to. In other words, the future begins in the past. To imagine your future, you need to immerse yourself in memories. Here is a piece of advice, for example, that might work. Try to recall a moment when you felt absolutely comfortable in your place. Note, I did not say when you were happy. I mean a situation in which you got along well with yourself, no one judged or evaluated you, and hopefully no internal voice nagged that you should have acted this way or that. If we have something in common, perhaps after such a memory, you will be transported to the period of early youth, those very years of formation. I remember how in graduate school I spent days and nights in the basement of the anatomy building. And although my workload as a graduate student was, as they say, over the roof, I fully immersed myself in robotics, creating constructions for studying the biomechanics of the body. Any memory I have of an occupation capable of completely absorbing me is connected with the search for answers to scientific questions, allowing me not to restrain my curiosity. And although I also remember disappointments and frustrations, curiosity is my second name. However, our goal is not just to remember. As Schechter asserts based on his research, retrieving specific memories helps us more vividly imagine trajectories of the future. In other words, so that the mind's gaze, aimed at tomorrow, does not get stuck in a thick fog, it is easier to transplant to your future some version of existing memories. I, for example, see myself still engaged in science, only now the answers I seek will be to different questions, not the ones I have now. My future selves work in completely different scientific fields. In this example, I rely on my own realities, others might not find it suitable. Your future must be built on your own memories. Additionally, you must take into account probable future regret. This process, in any case, is not linear. It works most reliably if you start with those memories that reflect the best in you, but don't try to force pictures of the future. They will appear themselves, likely at the most unexpected moment, for example, when you are moving. Movement and physical exercise are the best way to clear your thoughts of daily clutter. That's why our best ideas often come to us during sports activities. So your task is simply to tune your brain with selective memories while you're tying your sneakers. That will suffice. The rest will come when your brain unloads. The main difficulty is not to lose the idea that comes to mind. As soon as you finish your workout, consciousness returns to the present, and all creative thoughts evaporate like drops of sweat from the skin. This always troubled me. The most brilliant ideas, in my opinion, came to me during running, but as soon as I stood under the shower, they flowed away with the water. But now I run with a smartphone. If I get inspired while running, I stop and record a voice message. Usually it turns out the idea is so-so, but at least I keep it. It is important to remember that our goal is not to create a work of art, but to imagine your future. The process is this. Immerse yourself in selected good memories. Clear your thoughts through physical exercise and movement or by other means. Capture all valuable ideas that come to mind using any available tools. If everything is done properly, you will create a kaleidoscope of future selves. Since the future is unknown, these will just be fragments of mental images, a collage of fuzzy pictures. This is normal. Try to catch one of these fragments and hold it in your consciousness. Note the most obvious and noticeable details. Where are you? Alone or with someone? What are you doing? This is another technique that launches narrative brainstorming, described in the previous chapter. Only this time, we outline not a storyline but probable images of your future based on selected memories. If you manage to hold such an image longer, you can think about how to approach it. There is a huge distance between your current I and one of the future ones. You will understand you succeeded when, mentally envisioning the captured future I, you feel something in your stomach tightening with fear. This emotion is quite surmountable. The main thing is to have someone nearby to discuss everything with. Fear of the unknown sometimes literally paralyzes. Economists, as already mentioned, call this uncertainty avoidance, meaning that a person, like all animals, has an innate aversion to situations characterized by informational incompleteness. I found only one way to overcome fear of the unknown. Use a mental version of the algorithm used to win poker tournaments, counterfactual regret minimization, or CFR. As we know from Chapter 16, this algorithm models as many future scenarios as possible and chooses such a course of action that minimizes the likelihood of regret. Reflecting on your future self, you only need to consider two options. Either stick to your previous life trajectory or switch to one that brings you closer to the imagined future I. For clarity, let's consider a simple decision matrix. There are only two criteria in this matrix. The first, choice of action, continue your life trajectory or switch to the imagined one. The second, the state of affairs, implies the condition in which your world will find itself at some future moment. Of course, there are infinitely many probabilities. For example, the Earth might collide with an asteroid that destroys all life, and it turns out you wasted your time pondering. But for simplicity, let's consider two options, which I will denote as A and B. In option A, it is better for you to stick to the existing trajectory. In option B, it is better to switch. If both options have equal chances of realization, then, according to CFR, we only need to consider the two worst probabilities. If you decide to change trajectory, but the world comes to condition A, you will be worse off than if you had kept the previous trajectory. Conversely, if you do not change trajectory and the world comes to condition B, you will be worse off than if you had switched. CFR instructs to choose the least bad probability. This is how we minimize hypothetical regret. Such a choice does not guarantee the best outcome. It simply means that the chances of regretting the decision made are minimized. After a year of working on this book, I realized that it was time to get off this train. Since our children had grown up and flown the nest, my wife and I sold our house, bought a farm, and moved to the countryside. We gave our narrative a sharp turn, and we became completely different people. How do you switch from suburban life, where your main concern is finding a place that serves decent ramen, to raising chickens and cows and seriously worrying about whether it will rain or not? The answer lies in this book. I imagined a future version of myself, and I saw that I would most likely deeply regret it if I stayed in the city and didn't veer off the paved path. Although we knew almost nothing about farming, the prospect of continuing on the same tracks terrified me far more than the prospect of suffering a crushing failure in a new venture. That's why the person who started working on this book is no longer the one writing this epilogue. Does this mean the book was co-authored? If you've read this far, you know the right answer, yes. The co-authors share the same name and look the same, well, except for a couple of wrinkles and gray hairs. By the time the book reaches the store shelves, the author will have changed a little more. So, if you happen to bump into someone who closely resembles the author in some airport, they might search through their memory's luggage for a while before unpacking the material of this book. After all, for them, it's already a thing of the past, and they are probably consumed by thoughts of some future version of themselves. Acknowledgements. I have been lucky to work with my amazing colleagues who have shaped my understanding of the human brain and what distinguishes it from any other brain on our planet. For over 30 years, Reed Montague has inspired me and prompted me to seek answers to difficult questions in neuroscience. Our regular conversations are an inexhaustible treasure. Thanks to Monica Capra and Charles Nusser, I learned to think like an economist. Michael Pratchula and Tony Lemia shared valuable knowledge about the impact of media and information on the brain, as well as contributed to the development of several experiments. Scott Atran taught me humility when considering questions of morality and ethics. Philippe Rocha has inspired and supported me throughout the work on this book, patiently listening to my wild ideas and continuing to work on his own. We spurred each other on, helping each other stay on track during the COVID years. None of the studies I've described would have been possible without grants. Thanks to the coordinators of individual programs, new perspectives opened up for me. I am especially grateful to the late Terry Leon, who took me under his wing and introduced me to the area of activity in the Ministry of Defense I never even suspected existed. With funding for several of our projects, Ivy Estabrook was a huge help, as was Bill Casebeer. I am extremely grateful to Michelle Tesler for providing this book with a home when it was just taking shape. Working with Tig Kelleher, the editor-in-chief of Basic Books, was a huge stroke of luck for this project. This is the second book we've published with Tig, but before this, I didn't truly understand what a huge trust the relationship between a writer and a publisher requires. I think one book is simply not enough to fully grasp that. The editing itself was done by Tis Takagi, and she did it brilliantly, somehow magically making my writing voice sound even more like my true voice, at least the one it was back then. And finally, I want to thank my wife, Kathleen, who endured my latest laments and vows of no more books. More importantly, she dared to embark on new adventures with me. Who knows who will become as a result?